Okay, so welcome everyone. Today we're talking about cyber liability exposures for design firms and ways to manage and mitigate risk. Professional service firms face an increased exposure to cybersecurity risks and liabilities through their increased use and dependency on technology. While many firms take the necessary steps to secure their systems, guard their digital assets, protect confidential client information, and maintain the security of the projects they design, the capabilities of hackers and disgruntled former employees to bypass those safeguards are increasing every day. Every design firm should have digital protection protocols in place to not only better protect against a data breach, but also to manage data breaches in the event they occur. This requires prudent management of business and professional exposures and proper insurance to help firms minimize losses as well as minimize damages to clients and threats to the public. To help us get ahead of this issue and avoid the professional practice and overall business liability implications of this increasing digital threat, we have two experts with us today to speak to these issues. Jennifer Coughlin is a founding partner of Mullen Coughlin and admitted to practice in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. She focuses her practice on providing organizations of all sizes and from every industry sector first-party breach response and third-party privacy defense legal services. Ms. Coughlin has counseled hundreds of clients in investigating and responding to events that compromise information and system security. She works closely with client resources, third-party forensics, consulting experts, and law enforcement to identify the nature and scope of the compromise. She's represented numerous organizations and inquiries by regulators, including state attorneys general, state insurance departments, state health departments, the Federal Trade Commission, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the Office of Civil Rights. Bill Harden with Charles River Associates has worked on more than 1,000 forensic engagements in the areas of data breach and cyber incident response, theft of trade secrets, and white-collar crime. Many of his cases have been mentioned in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Forbes, and Krebs on Security, among others. With a background in finance, operations, and software development, he brings valuable insights to clients from multiple dimensions. In addition to his forensic engagement assignments, Bill has served in numerous interim management roles for organizations experiencing disruption. Bill is a CPA, CFF, certified fraud examiner, a certified project management professional, and holds an MBA from the Booth School of Business. Bill serves on the board for Legal Prep Charter Schools and is an adjunct professor at DePaul University in Chicago. So with that introduction, I will now turn this over to our speakers. Bill, you can go ahead and take it away.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, today we're going to be talking about cyber warfare, and most notably, we're going to be talking about two topics keen of interest for you to take away today. The first one we're going to talk about is ransomware and extortion. The second topic that we're going to talk about is business email compromise.
So, Bill, you should have control over the clicker at this point.
Yeah, I do not have control. Sorry.
Oh, there you go. Yep. Go ahead. If you'd like, I can click through for you.
Okay. Yeah, why don't we do that?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Next slide.
Yep.
Okay. So when we look at things from a technology perspective, we have to put things in a neutral attribution. So if you'll notice here on this sign, this is a construction sign. This is actually one of my favorite pictures that has been posted out on the net. And basically this sign is saying this sign has been hacked. So the questions that have to go through people's mind is, when we normally see street signs, they normally are telling us to go certain directions. For example, this road might be closed, or we need to take an alternative route. This enterprising person decided to walk up to this particular construction sign and input different types of directions here. And I use this from the aspect of technology we can use it for good purposes or bad purposes. The majority of individuals decide to use it for its intended purpose. And then we have other individuals that make a choice and say, I want to do something different. And that different can be from a perspective of taking things, doing this direction, or other things that were kind of unintended for a piece of whatever technology you want to use. And here in our case in point, we've been coded, the majority of individuals, when they see a street sign, as I said earlier, to follow those directions. Here, this person is just trying to say that we might want to take security on this a little bit more differently, because if they could come up here and put this in there, what else could they do to this? So from a neutral perspective, if you could click the next slide, we're going to go back in time here. And with that, being from the University of Chicago, we studied Aristotle, and there he is right there. And he talked about three different things. The art of rhetoric kind of talks about ethos, pathos, and leos. And when we look at things, we have to figure out, do I have an emotional attachment to them? And that's kind of what the ethos aspect of it is. So when I receive an email or if somebody asks me to do something, what is my emotional attachment to it? And then I look at it from a lejos perspective. Is it logical? Does this make sense? And in today's cyber warfare that's going on, our adversaries are using a lot of Aristotle techniques and trying to trick us into doing things that we're not accustomed to. And then as we continue to keep progressing through today's webinar, I'm going to keep referencing back to Aristotle so that you can have an appreciation of the trickery that was being performed back when he was alive is still well and around today. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite cartoons just to put things in perspective. And this kind of deals around IT budgets. As the two gentlemen are looking at the computer here, they're basically saying, I'm sure there are better ways to disguise sensitive information, but we just don't have a big budget. I would employ people listening here to the webinar that from an IT security perspective, the funds need to be put into that bucket. Why is that? A lot of it has to do with rules and regulations that Jennifer will be talking about later on during the webinar. But it also has to deal with your employer information, your employee information, your client's information. Lots of rules and regulations have changed over the last couple of years that have made reporting obligations very cumbersome for organizations. And Jennifer, can you elaborate a little bit on California Privacy Act and GDPR real quick, just to kind of put that into context?
Sure. So up until a few years ago, the laws that we were always concerned about were the laws that required you to disclose out to certain individuals, regulators, and consumer reporting agencies incidents where protected information was subject or was reasonably believed to have been subject to unauthorized access or acquisition. But now we have the advent of GDPR, California Consumer Privacy Act, and I'm sure on the heels of the California law, you will see similar laws enacted by other states, where these laws require organizations to take certain steps to secure data and also take certain steps when an individual to whom the data relates requests that the information be deleted. So it's going to expose organizations to obligations they didn't have in the past to take affirmative steps to secure data and also disclose to individuals how they are storing that data and how they are using that data. And that's going to increase exposure for organizations across the board.
Thank you, Jen. So as we can see from a budget perspective, when we're allocating certain things from an IT security and compliance perspective, it just continues to keep getting bigger and bigger on the information that we need to protect. Next slide, please. So with that, in protecting our assets, everyone here on the webinar today is going to be like Alice, and we are going to go down the rabbit hole now. And we are going to see how our adversaries are using Aristotle's practices and other means in order to potentially cause disruption in our organizations. Disruption can take many different forms. And as stated earlier, we're going to be talking about two very distinct disruptions that our firms, Mullen Coughlin and CRA, work on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about extortion. And from an extortion perspective, there's two different types of extortion that we're going to discuss. One is going to be called engagement extortion. And from an engagement perspective, that means I am going to send you a text message or an email, and we're going to have to make a decision if we are going to engage. The other type of extortion that we're going to talk about is what we call automation. Automation in the form of ransomware. Both different types of extortion bring their own types of disruption. In the automation scenario, it's about getting back into business. Those that have experienced a ransomware attack, you will have noticed that potential file servers, computers, phones, and so forth might not be working correctly or for their intended purposes because they've been encrypted. Hence, our adversaries have now weaponized encryption in order to make us pay funds in order for us to get back in business. While in the engagement extortion landscape, the adversary potentially has something of yours and is going to increase pressure points on you or the organization in order for them to get paid. Each one has its own different connotation with it. Next slide, please. In the engagement perspective, this is an email that's been going around the last few weeks. This is what we call a potential sextortion email. If you were to receive this in your inbox today, the question would be, how would you react? And we can see here, there's a couple of different things that the International Hacker Group is trying to make you do. If you go down to the second line, he says, I have access to your accounts. For example, your password is blank. The interesting thing about this particular engagement extortion is where it has your password, insert service password, that is actually a password that you have used. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, how did they get those passwords? Well, there have been thousands of data incident, data breach cases, and a lot of that information gets posted out on different dark forums. There's been a consolidation of information that is out there from previous incidents and breaches that has been put into a particular database. And this threat actor harvested information from that database, and he pulled out emails and passwords. For example, we all know that LinkedIn had a breach and they leaked credentials. Yahoo as well, Facebook. These are all different mechanisms that the majority of individuals potentially had an account on. And those
Bill,
are passwords.
let me jump.
Go ahead, Jen.
Sorry, go ahead. So the password distinction is important under the law because there are only certain states that protect username and password. So you may have heard of the LinkedIn breach. You may have heard of the Facebook breach. But there may have been other events where the security of your usernames and passwords have been compromised and you don't know about it because you may live in a state where notice is not due to you as a result of the incident. Or because so many people were impacted, they can provide what's known as substitute notice, which is not mailing you a letter, but sending you an email that may have been lost in spam and posting notice on their website where you never may have gone, and issuing notice to the media, which may or may not have run it. And if they did run it, it may be in a place that you don't frequent. So there are incidents that happen that may be where your information was lost, but you do not know about it. So there are Facebooks and LinkedIns that happen all the time that the media does not know about, does not report on, and you may not know about. So the username and password may appear in there and be legitimate and been breached at an organization that did not tell you about it. Sorry, Bill, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to throw that nuance in there.
Very, very good point, Jen. So, again, you've received this. As you can see, we have a password that is yours. They tell you, I've been monitoring you for a certain amount of time period. They also tell you that you've been doing naughty things, and they're asking for something. Again, from an engagement perspective, they were like $800 put to a particular Bitcoin wallet. And they tell you, if you don't know how to buy Bitcoin, here's how to do it. You can Google it. It's easy. It also has a time clock on here. If you drop down to the bottom, you have 48 hours to pay. So the question is, for people that are on the phone, would you pay or not pay? Some people have guilty conscience. Some people do not. Some people would throw this away. Other people might turn this over to their incident response team. But the question is, what do you do? We can tell you that the wallet, and there's multiple wallets that run this extortion scam, they have received 6 figures. So a lot of people have paid this particular ransom. Most notably, we can tell you that the majority of ransoms that look like this are a hoax. These are individuals that are just sending out mass emails, and they're preying on people's guilty conscience in order to make money. If you could click the slide to the next, please. This is a different type of engagement extortion request. Here, they're actually saying that insert your name, that we've gained access to things that we shouldn't have access to. They have pricing information, employee data, and customer list. They tell you that they are a for-profit group. They're asking for 70 Bitcoins to be sent to this particular wallet. Again, they're giving you 2 days in order to do it. From an engagement perspective, you have to ask yourself, is this real or is this fake? Could they actually have this data? And if they did, what could they do with it? For those that are on the webinar today, you can Google an organization called the Dark Overlord. This is a criminal syndicate group, and this is their typical modus operandum, and they send out these types of extortion requests. Normally, they do have the data, and again, they are negotiating for funds. The Dark Overlord group most notably plays a game, and if you choose not to play their game, they then increase the pressure on the organization. For example, they might start emailing your employees. They might start sending out messages to your clients. They might start texting beneficiaries within the organization. Normally, when they send this type of extortion request, they have data, lots of it, and then they are choosing to weaponize it if you do not play their game. So from a company perspective, we have to determine, is it real or is it fake? When do we bring law enforcement in? And how do we handle certain events like this? So Jen, when a company receives this type of extortion request, can you kind of walk us through the first 5 to 8 hours that you would go through?
Absolutely. So from our perspective, we're concerned about whether or not your information system has been subject to unauthorized access. And I have seen cases where an email was originating from a custodian's account to the custodian. So there was unauthorized access to my email account, and an intruder was using my email to send me a message and extort money from me. So we need to understand from a forensic perspective whether or not there has been unauthorized access to your network. And that's going to give us an idea as to whether or not the message is legitimate or if it is a hoax, whether or not they do have data relating to you or not. So we are working with law enforcement, and we are also working with Bill's firm to understand whether or not there was a compromise in the security of your information systems. If there was a compromise, what's the nature and scope of that? How much information was compromised? To whom does that information relate? To whom does that information belong? So the process is started immediately upon you calling us. We bring Bill in immediately. He starts investigating immediately. Sometimes Bill can tell from the get-go, this is a hoax, there's nothing to be concerned about. Other times he may say, we need to look around, I'm not sure. Or he'll know from the first call, you've actually 100% had a breach and we need to get in there and figure out what happened.
Thanks, Jen. So from a company perspective, after counsel's engaged, the question is going to be, do we engage with the extortionist or not? And if we start engaging, what are we going to negotiate? Are we going to pay or not pay? Or are we going to ask for proof of data or so forth? Next slide, please. So we finished talking about engagement extortion. Again, these are emails that are coming to you asking you to do something. The flip side to extortion is automation. And from an automation perspective, we call it multiple different things. We have BitPaymer, SamSam, WannaCry, Ryuk, Krypton, Bad Rabbit, Mary I Love You Bruce. I do not come up with the names. All of these are weaponized encryption in order to cripple your organization. And they can be launched one or two ways. They can be launched by the adversary, the threat actor, getting unauthorized access into your network, potentially taking data, and then weaponizing a payload in order to start its process. That's one way it can be done. Another way that it can be done is you have one of your users that clicks on an email and then weaponizes a payload doing it that way. So from an automation perspective, when we get involved, we have to figure out exactly what type of ransom it is, and then we start going through a pretty meticulous process to get you back in business. Next slide, please.
Bill, so I know we've worked with you on several design firms, professional services firms that have experienced a ransomware attack. And more often than not, we don't see that the organization is specifically targeted by virtue of who they are and what we do, but targeted by virtue of a vulnerability that they have. Can you talk through whether or not you see, from your perspective, organizations actually being targeted for who they are and what they do by these incidents, or anybody is susceptible to these events?
Absolutely, Jen. And on this slide that we have here, this is a website that professionals like myself can go out to that's out on the Tor network. It's called Xdetic. It's a subscription service. And what this provides is actual credentials into various different networks. And you can see, and we just pulled up the United States here, we have different regions of the U.S., cities. Keep scrolling across. This tells us whether I have direct access or admin credentials or not. And it gives me a price for them. So for individuals here that are on the phone, especially for your firms, if you have remote desktop protocol, RDP access, enabled externally to the net, there is a potential that your credentials to that site might be on Xdetic, and that's the site that's here. And if they are, I, as the adversary, might decide to target your organization in order to drop a payload. That's one way that I can do that. The other way that I can do that is what we talked about a little bit earlier with emails coming in. And again, this is more of a spraying operation to where you are not specifically targeted, you are collateral damage if one of your employees weaponizes the email. Hence, you are not particularly targeted. The adversary is sending out thousands of emails trying to find someone, the unfortunate victim, that is going to be tricked, if we go back to our Aristotle, from a logical perspective, from a layhost perspective. The person clicks on the email, weaponizes the encryption, and then bad things start to happen. Next slide, please. If you are the unfortunate victim of automation encryption, you will receive a note just like this. This is Ryuk. Ryuk is one of the latest variants that's going around. Currently, our firm has worked on dozens of Ryuk matters. We've had several in the architectural and design space. And the way that Ryuk works is the adversary has used RDP or another type of way to log into your network, and then they have dropped this payload. The developers of Ryuk are mostly in this for monetary gain. And if you'll notice here in their extortion email, they're basically telling you that your network's been penetrated. Do not do these things. You need to email at one of these two addresses to determine the ransom amount. They provide a Bitcoin wallet, and then they kind of give you a parting gift. No system is safe. The interesting thing about the Ryuk cyber gang is if you have backup, they will go in and delete your backups or make sure they're encrypted as well. For a lot of design firms and architectural firms, your data for your clients in order to do your business is the key. A lot of it won't contain personal identifiable information. A lot of it won't contain protected health data or various other things from a regulatory perspective. This isn't intended to take your data. This is intended to cripple the organization so you can't do your job. And they want to be paid in order for you to get your files back. Next slide, please. And if this happens, you will experience business interruption. And here on the phone today, if you can imagine that all of your systems start going down, how do I start doing things? And we just listed a few things up here. How do I make payroll if payroll's coming up and my systems are encrypted and I can't communicate? How do I communicate to my clients if I don't have email that's up and going? What do I do when my clients start requesting information? Or if I have other firms that are asking me things? So, Jen, when this starts happening and clients start calling, do we tell them that we're the victim of a ransomware attack? I mean, what kind of communication protocols can we put in place?
So we always want to be working with organizations as soon as they detect something happened so that we can figure out what happened, but also control the messaging regarding the incident. We don't ever want to use the B word, so we never describe things as breaches, but we want to make sure we are careful in what we are disclosing to individuals and other parties because that information may become public and we don't want it to become public, or if it does become public, we don't want it to be a real headache for us. So we are going to be telling individuals that are asking questions that we are investigating an incident. We're going to use language to keep it soft, and we will keep them up to date if there's any substantial developments that impact them. But the messaging is going to be very soft and is going to need to be planned out for not only your customers and your clients, but also your employees, because they may make statements on your behalf. We want to make sure we know what they're saying, that they're giving accurate information and not giving too much information.
Absolutely. Communication is key, especially in this type of event. because from a BI perspective, when systems go down, we have to make sure we're communicating, as Jennifer just stated, with our employees, potentially with our clients. And if the news media or somebody picks that up, we also need to be coming out with different statements in order to control the messaging. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite slides. Again, it's a cartoon. But since we're in a digital age, almost everything seems to be connected to the net. And with ransomware being so prolific, in our houses, we have internet cameras, we have smart thermostats, smart dishwashers, and so forth. But here, basically all the appliances in the house have been ransomed. And they're saying, in order for me to do my job today, you're going to have to pay me X amount of Bitcoin. Now, the interesting thing here is in the red circle, we circled the internet camera here. There was actually someone that weaponized 40% of the world's internet cameras related to a certain provider and used all those devices in order to launch a massive denial of service attack against the United States Eastern Seaboard that took down many, many different web servers within a 4 to 5 hour period. So if you go all the way back to our first slide when we talked about neutral, here we use web cameras in our houses, maybe to look at our loved ones from a baby monitor perspective, maybe to monitor our grounds, maybe to see if our children are doing things they shouldn't be doing. But it came with a default username and password, and a clever person decided to say, hey, can I take all of this particular device and use them for something else? It's only a matter of time before we start seeing other devices being used to do these purposes. Just this morning, December 13th, there is an organization that is launching a product for gamers out on the internet. When they buy certain types of rigs, and when it's idle, they can use that idle time in order to mine cryptocurrency off the blockchain. I can see that type of thinking being used for all our connected devices, that when they're idle, they could also mine off the blockchain. Okay, next slide, please. So we've talked about ransomware, and we've talked about extortion and automation. Now we're going to talk about phishing, because phishing is prolific and it works. And unfortunately, a lot of our employees do things and they click on links, they put in credentials, they don't think about doing certain things. If something doesn't work, they're like, well, it's just a glitch, and I just move on. The thing about phishing is sometimes it's very targeted, but other times it's just more spraying out there to see who's going to operationalize it. And if we look back at Aristotle, again, I have to look at it, is this email logical? Do I have any empathy in it, right? Or what's my emotional attribution? And you'll see here in some of the subject lines, I've got to make you do something, right? So, urgent action required. You need to open this email, right? Microsoft, your account will be deactivated. I've shared a file with you. Again, I am trying to make you open something in order for you to give me something. So they come up with very creative ways in order for people to operationalize these phishing emails. Next slide, please. And when you open up one of these phishing emails, this is just one that we're providing here, a lot of times they don't know what email system you're working on. So they will say, hey, you just got this from Dropbox. Please select your email provider. Again, the adversary doesn't know what system you're actually working for. So he's putting the most common ones on there in order for you to click on that link and then go out to a site in order to put your credentials in. And if our employees aren't trained to notice that this is trying to trick them, then we are not educating our employees enough in order to raise alarm bells. Next slide, please. So how does it work? A typical phishing campaign works like this. Here you have the threat actor with the hat on. He's sending it out to 300 individuals. This is a stage 1 attack. 255 of the individuals didn't do anything. 30 of them in yellow, they actually clicked on the link, but nothing really happened. But then we had 15 individuals that clicked on the link, put in credentials, and then a backdoor was created. So here, now that the adversary has 15 individuals, potentially he can go into their email box and start looking around and start doing different things. The thing is, when people operationalize an email, are they interesting to the adversary? Sometimes they'll run search terms to try to find certain things. Maybe you're in charge of invoicing. Maybe you're in charge of wire transfers. Maybe you're in charge of personnel. And if you are in charge of those things and that data is in your email box, then the adversary might think that you are interesting and might want to stick around. They might set up forwarding rules in your email box or rules to delete certain messages, unbeknownst to you. So while you're doing your daily job, the adversary is doing their job and learning about you. So what can they do? What are the different things? Next slide, please. So at CRA, we came up with a tic-tac-toe board of escalation. We start with blue, go to yellow, and then we're up to red. So from an email perspective, the question is, where would your employees fall on this listing here? Sometimes the adversary is going to log in, and if we're up in the top quadrant here, he is going to use your email box to phish others. The reason he would use your email box to phish others is because others trust you. You are a trusted contact of them, and if you send a message out asking them to open a document, probably high likelihood that they would do that. As we talked about a little bit earlier, box number 3, we have inbox rules and forwarding that are set up. I might log in, set up a forwarding rule, and just log out. Unbeknownst to you, all your emails are going out externally to me, and therefore I'm reading them. I might decide to harvest your contact listing. So all the contacts that are in your email box, I just might decide to harvest them and sell them out on various different forums. So that's kind of our blue quadrant. When we get into our orange quadrant, we start getting into a lot of regulatory data. And Jen, when you see PCI data, PHI or PII within email, what things start going through your mind?
Alarm bells start ringing for us because that's the type of data that, in addition to data that you may have agreed to pursuant to contracts with your clients to keep confidential, that's the type of data that you are going to see triggering reporting obligations out to individuals, regulators, consumer reporting agencies, possibly other third parties as well. So when we have business email compromise cases, which Bill can attest to the truth of this statement, I believe is at least one of every 3 phone calls that we receive, the other 2 being ransomware, which we already talked about. When we have business email compromise cases, we are always concerned about the content of the email account and also identifying what the intruder had access to. And Bill, I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'd like to talk through how we investigate business email compromise cases.
Absolutely. So in the red, you'll also notice here that now the adversary might decide to do things. For example, you have a client of yours that you've been doing business with, and the adversary notices that you've been sending out large invoices to them. They might in turn find a change form in your email box, change the wiring instructions, email your client and say, oh, by the way, we've changed banks, send the money here. Then they might set up a rule so anything coming back in from your client, you don't read because it goes to a different folder. Technically, you'll find out about it because if your client pays and you still have an accounts receivable outstanding with them for 60, 90 days, you might say, well, you guys always pay me. So then you pick up the phone and they're like, no, I paid that invoice. And then when we come in from an investigation perspective, we start seeing what's happened. Direct deposit payroll fraud, again, if your employees don't get paid, they might ring alarm bells. And what we see a lot is if you have a third-party system like Workday or ADP or Paylocity, things that you will notice are username and passwords that are used for email potentially might be used for those systems as well. The adversary will log into those systems, make changes there to bank routing data, and then set up rules in the email box unbeknownst to your employees that their banking information has changed. The last bucket over here, the theft of intellectual property. Again, for folks that are here on the phone, you might have secret sauce, design blueprints, things that you're doing for organizations, maybe potential government contracts that are very proprietary to you. This is how your business operates. The adversary might see that data in there, take that, and try to sell that on dark markets. We have been employed by many different architectural firms to scavenger the dark net and to look for different types of design, blueprint, things of that nature to see if their proprietary data is there. Next slide, please.
Bill, how often do you find it?
Well, depending on timing. The dark net is a vast pool. It depends when the adversary wants to sell. We have a lot of handlers that are out there looking for potential data. We might see it 6 months from now, a year from now. We might see it very quickly, or we might not see it at all.
Thank you.
So in closing, I just want to let everyone know here that security matters. We've talked about increasing budgets, again, with our cartoonish folks. We've also talked about two different things that you're most notably going to see: extortion and business email compromise. And as Jen has stated, almost 1 out of every 3 phone calls that we receive is related to one of those two things. If you experience one of these two things, hopefully you can take away some stuff from today in order to better prepare you when the event comes. So Jen, now that I've talked about all the different things that potentially might happen, when they do happen from a regulatory perspective and from a legal aspect, can you provide guidance here for our folks on this webinar?
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill. So as Bill talked about, he has the juicy part of the presentation. He's talking about the actual trends that we're seeing out in this space now. And we are seeing a lot of business email compromise cases. We are seeing a lot of ransomware cases. And what we're concerned about from the legal perspective is what happened, how it happened, whether or not it's ongoing, and what information may be at risk as a result of the incident. Because the answers to those questions will help us determine whether or not an organization has any legal obligations arising from the incident to report the incident out to individuals, regulators, consumer reporting agencies, other third parties. So Yvonne, if you could advance the slide, that would be great. Thank you. So our focus on what information may be at risk is going to be driven by what information is protected pursuant to laws that we're concerned about. So in the U.S., we are going to be concerned about what state's law define as personally identifiable information. And that's going to be a resident's name in combination with the types of information that I'm sure you think would fall in this bucket. Social security numbers, driver's license numbers, state identification numbers, financial account information, credit card or debit card information, online or financial account username and password, medical information, health insurance information, email address and password. You can add passport number to that as well. So that's what we're concerned about on the state level. On the federal level, when you are a covered entity or a business associate under HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, there is going to be something known as protected health information that you need to be concerned about. So that's going to be information created or received by a covered entity or business associate that relates essentially to the treatment of an individual. So past, present, or future treatment of an individual, payment for the provision of treatment of that individual, the condition of that individual as well. And then we are also concerned from a credit card perspective, if you accept credit cards, about PCI. So that's cardholder data. So you will see overlap amongst those three categories as well. You can have information constituting PII under state law, PHI under federal law, and PCI data as well. And then we're also concerned about information you've agreed to keep confidential pursuant to contracts. So you may have incidents where under the law, there's no obligation for you to report the incident out because the information is not protected or the information hasn't been accessed or acquired without authorization. But under a contract, you may be required to report an incident out to a client, even if it's unauthorized access to your network, but not data relating to that client, or data that isn't sensitive and protected pursuant to law, but is sensitive and proprietary to the client or pursuant to the contract. Next slide, please. So on the state side, there are 50 states that have data breach notice laws, and these laws require organizations when they experience unauthorized access or acquisition to protected data relating to state residents, to tell those residents about the incident. And sometimes the law also requires the organization to tell the state regulator, usually the Attorney General, or the consumer reporting agencies, or both, about the incident. And notice is typically due to be provided without unreasonable delay. There are some states that do put a specific number of days from the date of discovery that you are supposed to report the incident out within their law. There are other states, such as Indiana, where the law says provide notice as expedient as possible without unreasonable delay. However, we know from experience that the regulator, the Attorney General in Indiana, who is very active, interprets their law to require that to be 30 days. You must provide notice to their impacted residents and also their office within 30 days. The state regulators, there are a few states that do require notice be provided to the state regulator in their office. In the other states where such notice is not required to be provided, the state regulator is still empowered to enforce the data breach notice law and take steps to investigate an incident impacting the security of data relating to their residents. And there are some regulators that are more active than others, and some regulators do take the investigations all the way to the point of attempting to get you to enter into an assurance of voluntary compliance, so an actual settlement agreement with them, where they do want you to admit some wrongdoing for the incident, and they want you to agree to take certain steps to safeguard information in the future and provide disclosures to their impacted residents in their office if there were some type of incident in the future. But those assurances of voluntary compliance also often require the organization to pay some type of settlement amount. And we've seen settlement amounts in the range of $5,000. We've seen settlement amounts in the ranges of millions. So it really varies, and it is going to be driven by the circumstances of the incident, the number of impacted individuals, how egregious the event was, and whether or not the organization could have taken steps other than those it had taken to protect against the incident from happening in the first place. And there are some states that allow for a private right of action for violations of the data breach notice laws, but there are other laws within those states, even if there isn't a clear-cut private right in the data breach notice law, there's going to be other claims that can be made in that state and asserted against the organization. So we are seeing litigation occur more than it has in the past. We do have some courts saying that in order for an individual to move forward with their claim, they have to prove that they have experienced some type of injury as a result of the incident, and that the potential for future injury, so future identity thefts, some courts say that's not enough. Other courts do say that is enough to move forward with your claim, and that's when we're starting to see the settlement actions that occur. Next slide, please, Yvonne. So the next 5 slides, 6 slides really, they are recitations of the states that have recently enacted changes to their laws. And the reason that I put all this information on these slides is to show you how active the legislatures are in revising these laws and taking these laws seriously and taking data privacy seriously and moving forward with efforts to ensure the protection of information relating to their constituents. So the laws are constantly changing, and regulators are becoming more forceful with their intention to enforce any type of alleged violations of their laws. So we have 8 minutes. I'm not going to go through these 6 slides, but I encourage you to review them so that you can see the changes that are occurring and the types of changes to see how aggressive the legislatures are becoming. Yvonne, do you mind forwarding to the HIPAA slide, please? Thank you. So this slide may or may not be applicable to you, but I wanted to raise it because there is a notion that some organizations believe HIPAA does not apply to them because HIPAA only applies to places like health insurance providers and hospitals and doctors' offices. And while it does apply to those organizations, it also applies to organizations that operate self-insured health plans for their staff. So if you operate a self-insured health plan for your employees and their families, you are going to be a covered entity under HIPAA and have federal obligations to safeguard information collected and maintained in connection with providing those services to your staff and providing notices of any incidents of unauthorized access or acquisition to that kind of data to the individuals to whom the information relates, to regulators, possibly to the media as well. It's going to depend upon the circumstances of the matter. And there are also organizations that may be business associates. I don't think that applies here, but I encourage you all to talk to whomever you provide your health insurance services through to understand what kind of organization you truly are, and you will then gain an appreciation of whether or not you have any obligations under HIPAA to be taking certain steps. So next slide, please. So under state law, a breach is defined, it's defined in each state statute, but it's essentially defined to be unauthorized access or acquisition to protected information that compromises the security, confidentiality, or integrity of that information. And it can be situations where you aren't sure if there was a compromise, but you don't have evidence to conclusively say that there was not a compromise. And this is where I want to segue into how we investigate business email compromises, but it also applies under HIPAA, which defines a breach as impermissible use or disclosure under the privacy rule that compromises the security or privacy of the protected health information. So up until about, Bill, I think you'd agree with me, about 18 months ago, the way we would have to investigate business email compromise cases was we had to assume the entirety of the email account was at risk as a result of the incident, because we were not able to identify exactly what messages were accessed by the intruder while in the account, separate and apart from any messages that were forwarded by virtue of a forwarding rule that they set up. So we would not be able to determine what the intruder looked at, so what information was subject to unauthorized access. So we would have to look at the entirety of the email account and identify what protected information is contained in that email account, and then provide notice, almost always over notifying, to every single person to whom that information relates, and to regulators based upon the numbers. And then about 18 months ago, logs were identified to be accessible that identified the messages in certain circumstances that were actually accessed by the intruder, which was a great development from our perspective, because we went from having to include everything to only include those messages that we know for sure were accessed or acquired without authorization by the intruder. So I had cases where prior to those logs becoming available, we had notice go out to 35,000 people, 40,000 people, because we couldn't rule anything out. Therefore, we had to rule everything in. But after these logs became available, we were able to determine that it was really a small number of messages that were actually looked at by the intruder But even further, we were then able to look at those messages and determine that they didn't even have protected information in there. So while it was not a great incident for the organization to have, it was a bit of a fender bender because they experienced the heartache that comes when you have a breach, but they didn't have to experience the potential reputational brand damage that comes when you have to report the incident out. Bill, do you want to add a little bit how we investigate the business email compromise cases from your perspective?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. And I can't echo that enough. Everything is a data incident, hence we've had credentials leaked, until Jennifer determines that it has actually risen to the level of a breach. And with that, from a forensic technology perspective, we've been able to harness more detailed logging within certain email systems in order to ascertain exactly what the intruder actually touched. So if the intruder logs in and they run a certain particular set of search terms, for example, let's say you're using Workday as your payroll provider. The adversary logs in, they run search terms for Workday, only 10 messages come back out of your mailbox that you have 1,000 messages in. If we're able to harness those logs, we can actually tell what the intruder touched. Therefore, only the potential 10 are in scope, as opposed to the other 990 that might have had all of this other information contained within it. So I can't say enough that the technology that's been developed over the last couple of years have allowed us to get a little bit more granular in order to provide Jennifer better information in order to give better legal advice.
And we have a few more slides, and everybody's going to get a copy of the slides, but I did want to cover one more thing. I know we're short on time. My perspective of ransomware events. So what ransomware is, dumbing it down, is it is a virus that prohibits your ability to access your data. That prohibition in and of itself, from my perspective, is not unauthorized access or acquisition to that information. Now, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that enforces HIPAA, they have come out with a guidance that says that is your inability to access that information is going to be an incident under their law. But from our perspective, it's a prohibition of your ability to access. It doesn't automatically mean that somebody else is accessing that information without authorization. However, ransomware events are developing from an event on your network where there is actual unauthorized access to your information systems and information stored on those information systems before the ransomware is dropped. So there is unauthorized access to your network, and we need to understand, and we rely upon Bill to tell us what they were doing in your environment before that happened. And we have seen instances where they're just snooping around to understand how your system works and the architecture of your systems, just so they're getting recon so that they know how to best deploy the ransomware to your system. And what they're concerned about is getting you to pay the ransom, making sure you have no ability to operate business as usual and you have no choice but to pay the ransom. But we are now seeing cases where the intruder comes into your system, and yes, they are snooping around and looking for that information, but they're also dropping other types of malware on your system that can harvest credentials that can be used to access your systems, but also your organization's financial account. And you can see from those instances happening that we are then having unauthorized access to an organization's actual online bank account, and wire transfers are being initiated, and we see fraud and loss occurring that way. And then the ransomware happens on top of that. So when we have an organization come to us reporting that they experienced a ransomware event, we are concerned about how the intruder got onto the system, how the ransomware was introduced to the system, but what they were doing on the system before the ransomware was actually dropped. So I encourage all participants on this webinar to keep in mind that ransomware is not usually just quote-unquote ransomware, and maybe something that requires an actual investigation, not just wiping systems to understand what happened, because there are legal ramifications for ransomware events and also business email compromise events, and it's not just an incident that's impacting how your business operates, although it absolutely is doing that. It's also going to have potential legal ramifications for you. Yvonne, I'm sorry I went over.
Well, that's okay. Do you want me to keep advancing? We probably...
No. We can skip all the other slides. Everybody has access to them. It's just further information about HIPAA and PCI.
Okay. Do you want to touch on these best practices really quick, or?
Sure, Bill. Do you want to lead that?
Absolutely. So from a best practice perspective, again, we've gone through a couple of different things today, most notably business email compromise and ransomware, extortion, and automation. But with that, we want to have you guys take a few things away. Do you have a response team in place? Do you have an incident response team in place? Your incident response team will be decision makers that are going to decide what the organization is going to do. If you don't have one of those in place, it's always good to start thinking about, if we have this event, who are the team players that are going to be on the team in order to make decisions. The second point that we like to leave you with is make sure that you have counsel involved. Inside counsel at a minimum, outside counsel always recommended. Because the thing is, when you start these types of investigations, you never know what you're going to find. And in addition to that, the data that you do find going through the investigation might not rise to a level that you have to go out and report it on. If you remember, Jen has talked about everything as a data incident. It's her determination, as well as other counsel, to determine, has it risen to the level of a breach? Because when you say the big B word, you have a lot of legal ramifications. And we leave you with our third point here. People throw around terms lightly. You know, they're just saying, oh, it's a breach. Oh, it's PII. Oh, we got this and that. Well, from a legal determination and connotation perspective, those words matter. And if we're drafting emails and sending them around without counsel involved on them, saying, oh, it's a breach, or we're out doing publications or things of that nature, we have to be very careful on the messaging. And as we talked about earlier in our presentation, crisis management and communication is key. The terms that we use will define how we're able to get through this. So don't tread lightly on what you're doing with that.
Yeah, just to echo what Bill said, you may have an incident that doesn't rise to the level of something you need to report out, and you want to keep close to the vest what you know about the incident. You don't want to tell a lot of people about it because you may have something that you don't need to tell anybody about. But if your receptionist hears somebody talking about it at the water cooler and they tell somebody about it, or they post something on Facebook, all of a sudden you have messaging that you need to be concerned about and reply to that you may not have otherwise had to in the first place if you kept it quiet. So that really talks on the first point of this slide, do not rush to go public. So you want to know what happened, how it happened. You want to answer the key questions anybody that finds out about the incident will ask. What happened, how it happened, is it still ongoing, what information may be at risk, what are you doing to prevent something like this from happening again? And sometimes you have the answers to those questions on the very first day. Other times it takes weeks of forensic investigation with Bill's team to be able to answer that. And then once you know you do have to tell people about the incident, you want to be careful about what you're telling them. You don't need to tell them everything. You want to provide messaging that's compliant and responsive to any questions that you receive, but nothing more. And you always want to be aware of the fact that you may have something that you may think is not a big deal at all, and you may get slammed with a class action the next day by your employee population. Fine, employees are litigious people, so are customers, but so are employees. So that's something that you need to be aware of. And anything that you're putting in writing, you want to consider whether or not, if that was slid across the table to you during a deposition, or when and was revealed to a judge, what kind of position would your organization be in as a result of that? So you want to be concerned that litigation may always happen and be prepared for that. But you also want to conduct a risk assessment and implement data security improvements prior to being asked by a regulator, but you can do that prior to experiencing an event. And Bill and his team oftentimes provides assistance to organizations that want to take a look at their system and want to understand what vulnerabilities they have and what information they have on their system and whether or not they need to have that information and whether or not the information is appropriately secured, and take steps to remediate any vulnerabilities and issues that are identified during that process. It's a really good exercise for your organization to go through that process and understand what you have and what you can do now to mitigate your risk in the future. Yvonne, if you wouldn't mind sliding to the next slide.
Yep.
So another thing, thank you. So another thing, sorry, go ahead, Yvonne.
Oh, I was just saying, there you go.
Oh, okay, thank you. So another thing that organizations should be doing is preparing for the inevitable, preparing for the incident. How can you do that in addition to looking at your systems and understanding what you have? You need to identify your first responders and prepare an incident response plan. And not only prepare it, but test it repeatedly. Identify scenarios that may impact your organization. And scenarios for your organizations will include the ransomware that we discussed, business email compromise, and another one that will start hitting in a few weeks. Bill, I'm sure you'll agree with me, W-2 cases, where you have fraudsters pretending to be somebody at your organization, emailing somebody else within your organization, asking for copies of all W-2s so that you allegedly have a meeting with the IRS and you need that information to be prepared. But it's instead being provided to an attacker, and the attacker files fraudulent tax returns almost immediately on TurboTax with that information. We see design firms hit with those three types of scenarios all the time, and I don't anticipate that's going to change in the future. But that doesn't mean you have to fall victim to these attacks. You can identify who at your organization is going to be part of the response team, prepare the incident response plan, what you're going to do and in what order when you have an incident like that, and test the incident response plan frequently.
Okay, I think, does that conclude your remarks, Jennifer, at this point?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Jennifer, Bill, for the information you shared today. I'm confident that our attendees learned a lot and hope everyone found it useful. If you enjoyed this presentation and found it helpful to your practice and operations, and again, you are a Schinner policyholder, this webinar was recorded and will be available on demand for CE credit within the next 45 days on our School of Risk Management e-learning platform, so that you can share this with your employees or peers within your firm. So what you're seeing real quick here, and I'll take only a minute of your time, this is the landing page for the new School of Risk Management, which, among other things, houses our on-demand courses for design professionals. So you see the tile on the far left, continuing your education. This is where our policyholders can get into the e-learning platform. We developed this and launched this last year in recognition that we know our policyholders need CE. They also need risk management education. So we combined the two needs and created this new platform so that you and your employees can come 24/7 anytime and watch a webcast, take a quiz, and get CE credit for doing so. Our goal here was to give our firms easy access to on-demand risk management content to help you mitigate your risk and stay ahead of the curve on the latest in industry trends. As of today's date, we have 34 other courses available for design professionals on various relevant risk topics, risk management topics, such as today's, but also project-specific risks and operational risk-related content. That number in 2019 is going to grow as we host additional webinars like this one. We also have a library of written guides and resources to help you and your firm and colleagues stay on top of the best practices, whether it's contract issues, technology, marketing, staffing, HR, and a host of other issues. So we thank you once again for your time today. Please do expect a survey coming to your email inbox in which you can ask questions, give us feedback. And if you are a Schinner policyholder, as I mentioned earlier, the survey link that we send you will have a question specifically for CE credit. So all you need to do is just tell us what you want us to do, report it directly to AIA, or send you a certificate, and we'll do so. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much for attending. Have a nice day.